Surf fishing and fly fishing. There are two styles of angling that can be intimidating to the uninitiated, which means that combining the two must require 401 level skills, right? Not so fast. As summer gives way to fall, hundreds of miles of coastline on both sides of the U.S. will experience migratory runs of striped bass, as well as a reawakening of resident fish as the water cools. Fishing media loves to portray saltwater fly fishing as a complex endeavor, but if you're new to it, the reality is that stripers are fairly easy targets. Most importantly, not having a boat to chase them on isn't as big a deal as you think. From the surf to jetties to tidal rivers and quiet bay backwaters, stripers provide a great entry-level target for salty fly anglers on foot. And today, we're going to demystify what's often perceived as a highly complicated game and get you prepped for the fall run. I'm Outdoor Life Fishing Editor Joe Cermele, and this is the Quick Strike Podcast. So joining me today is my good friend and fellow writer, Mike Carr. And of all the anglers I fish saltwater with, Mike is by far the most passionate about catching striped bass on the fly. Now, I love saltwater fly fishing too, of course, but Mike is the kind of guy that will, at times, suffer through watching the gear guys he's with pound fish for a shot at just one or two bass on that whipstick. So more to come on that in just a minute. But I actually admire his drive and dedication very, very much. To Mike, there is no better feeling than connecting to a striper on the fly. And given that fishing is such a personal thing, he doesn't really need much more reason than that. Now, Mike gets out on boats plenty, but does not own one, which means most of his pursuits are on foot here in the Northeast. And he's been doing it for years, and he does a terrific job of breaking down the key components to success and simplifying the process. So, is it always a layup? Of course not. It's fishing. But his tips are guaranteed to shorten the learning curve if you're itching to strip into stripers from shore. So from the essential but not insanely expensive gear you need, to setting your expectations, to carrying 3 or 4 simple patterns that get it done, and using a few natural clues to plant yourself in the right places. Let's get on the path to striper success. So Mike Carr is so devoted to fly fishing for stripers that I've actually been on a boat with him, right? I've seen this happen where I am dropping rubber shads and getting hit every drop before it hits the bottom. And this man will not put down a fly rod with a heavy sink tip line, right? So just in your own words, Mike, what is the addiction to fly? Why are you the way you are? You are, Mike.
Just to build off that story for a second.
Yeah.
Joe was very encouraging the entire time that I was on that flyer.
I didn't try to get you to change at all.
He didn't try to get me to change at all. He was like, you go, man. It wasn't every 5 seconds. Mike, you want a shad?
Yeah.
Mike,
yeah.
Hey, Mike, you want a shad?
Yeah.
Pick up a shad. Pick up a shad. No.
Yeah.
Why am I the way I am? I guess
I'm teasing, of course.
Okay.
I always have to ask, like,
Yes.
if you're that devoted, especially in a saltwater setting, that's very different from trout. There's a lot more elements which we'll talk about in being successful there. You know, what's the passion? Why stripers and fly for you?
We are kind of about the same age. We have about the same family situation in terms of kids and time, and I don't get to go very often.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to go, I'm going to do it the way that I enjoy most to target these fish. You know, I get a very limited chance to get out on the water. When I do, I want to make the most of it. I want to try to catch a fish that I really love. You know, I mean, it's hard to say like you love a fish, but like, yeah, I do. If you ask a lot of people on your shows, you know, would you one fish forever for the rest of your life? I know exactly what it would. It would be a striped bass in shallow water on a gin clear setting and beautiful high sky, and I would just I would cast to those fish all day.
Well, that said, so now here we are coming into your prime season. We're coming into fall here in the Northeast, and the striped bass certainly have their conservation issues, but for the most part, it's funny because I remember when I was very young. You know, I started fly fishing when I was like 10, and one day I was in the dentist's office, and he fly fished, and there was a fly mag sitting in the waiting room, and I opened it up, and I saw like a guy with a striper and a fly rod, and it clicked in my head. I'm like, you can fly fish in salt water? I didn't even realize that when I was little. So my first foray into this was just trying to throw way too big of flies on like a eagle claw, yellow, whatever. I think saltwater fly fishing for people who are interested in trying it, it's a very intimidating thing. It's not a pond, it's not a lake, it's not a little river. But because I think that at the moment the striper population is strong enough with smaller resident fish, I actually think that they've gone from something sort of mythic and unattainable to now. I always tell people that's a great entry level fish if you live where you have access to them. They're actually not that difficult. Now, you spend plenty of time on boats, right? Charter boats and things, and you get out there on a boat when you can. But if you're flying solo, man, like you will go do this from the rocks, from the jetty, from the beach. And a lot of people don't have access to boats, which certainly makes any kind of fishing easier. Surf fishing with conventional gear is challenging enough. I think doing what you do with a fly rod is even sort of a level up from that. But once you sort of break it down, it's in my opinion, if you understand some basics, it's not that difficult to get into some stripers on fly with your feet on land. They might not be 30 pounders necessarily, but there's enough fish out there and they're predictable enough where it's very achievable if you don't have that much experience. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I had a similar entry into it as you did, where I was casting a 6-weight with a giant clouser on it and hooking myself every 5 seconds.
Smacking yourself in the back.
Smacking myself in the back.
Yeah.
And you're casting into the wind in the wrong spot in the wrong place. And it's all, it became for me all trial and error. I didn't want to, it was something for me that was so kind of personal. When I get a chance to go out and do it, I want to do it, and I wanted to learn it myself. You practice yourself, you practice in the yard, and then you actually get out on the water and give it a try. And I think that's the thing that stops many people from taking it up the first time, is that there's a mystery to it.
Sure,
you don't know where you're looking at the ocean. Where do you go?
Bays, oceans, tidal rivers. It's a lot of water. It's not as easy to break down, for sure.
And the fish are in one place one day and they're not there the next day because they move. And
right.
You're dealing with wind, and you're dealing with tide, and you're dealing with wind against tide, and you're dealing with movement and migrating bait fish, and all these different things that you can get really lost in the weeds of saltwater fly fishing if you let yourself.
Sure.
But the first thing, that people should do, and if you're interested in trying to catch a striped bass on a fly rod from shore, is to go and scout some places when you're not fishing.
Right.
Go look at some water when you're taking the kids to the boardwalk and seeing if there's some structure around, if there's a jetty around, if you see like a weird wave pattern, that usually means there's a drop off.
Sure.
Okay, there's so many different things that you can do when you're not fishing. And,
right.
And for me, I'm always doing that. And I will have outings and different, particularly, I get a chance to spend some time on Martha's Vineyard, and when we're going down to the fish market, or we're driving along the coast, I'm just always looking.
I think that's just fishermen in general. I've almost gotten into so many fender benders because I'm like looking at a puddle on the side of the road. Right. Like, my wife, even though she's like, stop looking at water, I'm like, I can't help it. I can't help it.
We're drawn to water.
But let's sort of break. So my goal with this, right, is really trying to simplify this. And there's this notion that saltwater fly fishing, especially, is this big complex thing that requires a lot of money and like really specialized gear. But I think, between what and what I know, and you do this a lot more than I do, I think it's possible to sort of put a package together, if you will, right? Sure. So for anybody thinking about doing this, let's start here, because I want to talk more about reading the beach and figuring out where to plant yourself. But let's just start, since we've both learned the hard way that you can't cast a heavy dumbbell eye clouser on a 4-weight eagle claw fly rod.
That's not going to work. Yep.
Let's talk setups a little bit. So, and I know this is one of those things that drives writers like you and I nuts. It's like, break it down into one thing. Yeah, there's a million things. You want this line for this, and then, but there's always a way to sort of narrow it down, right? So
Sure.
outfit-wise.
Outfit-wise, I mean, for Northeast striped bass fishing, a 9-foot 9-weight rod with an intermediate line is never going to go wrong anywhere.
Right.
All right. You can use that for the beach, for the back bay, for out on a boat. You can use it for off a jetty. You can use it for anywhere you want. You change the leader setup. You can throw a topwater fly on it. There's many ways that you can do it. It's just I think that's I don't want to steal that from Tom Rosenbauer, but I think it was Rosenbauer who said like he would rather have a 9-foot 9-weight in any saltwater setting anywhere, right? Sure. He was that for me that's my go-to. That's what I always use.
Now, you had mentioned an intermediate line, right?
Yeah.
So for people who don't understand what that is, an intermediate line sinks, but very slowly. They're often clear or light colored. They look like a floating line, but they sink very slowly. So you have floating line, intermediate line, and then you have lines that sink very quickly, which all have a time and a place. But to your point, for the most part, most of what you're going to be doing with stripers, most settings, you're going to want that little bit of sink, right? So that's going to help with weighted flies. But even if you are throwing poppers, and we'll talk about sort of like the nitty gritty flies that if you have nothing else, have these. To Mike's point, if you tie a longer leader onto an intermediate line, which is going to create a belly when you cast, as long as that leader is nice and long so it doesn't pull your fly down too quickly, you can fish a topwater fly on a slow sinking intermediate line. So I would agree with that totally. If somebody was like, I'm buying one line for stripers, you're buying an intermediate slow sinking line.
Right.
Now, I will say, because people hit me up all the time and they want gear recommendations for all kinds of things.
So are we going to talk branding now? We're going to go through all of the myriad of lines that we could go through?
No, we're not going to go through all that. No, we're not going to talk about specific lines. Okay, you can Google intermediate slow sinking line and you get one in your budget because it's one of those things that's hard to argue one is really better than the other. I'm sure you have one you love and so do I, but just sort of base level here. Now, what I will say though, because people hit me up for gear all the time, like you get the 9-foot 9-weight you can afford, right? And that's fine. I will say that in this game, a sealed reel is a bit more important than it would be in freshwater. So in other words, a reel that has a sealed drag, because if you're doing this and you're wading, especially if you're fishing the beach or a jetty where you're going to take spray, your fly reel is going to get salt water on it.
And the first time you catch a striper on a fly rod, you're gonna drop your rod in the water for sure. 100%. And the sealed drag reel is nearly essential for saltwater fishing.
Yeah.
Now you can get away with a lesser reel only up to a certain point, right? It's gonna fail eventually,
right?
So to invest a little bit more in maybe a higher level reel is a good thing for sure.
That doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a Van Stall or like the top shelf. But, I always say like with trout, people are like, well, what reel do I need for trout? I'm like, you can buy a $10 Fluger Medalist at a flea market because it's just a line holder and it's not going to, it sort of is what it is. But a striper is going to take some line. Your drag will engage. So, there's tons of them out there. I'm not, I have no affiliation with them. I was always been a big fan of like the Reddington Behemoth. That's a very affordable reel. That's a workhorse. But, I would put some thought into your reel, especially if you're not on a boat, because it will get wet. It will hit sand at some point. Now, another big one, and this is what I struggle with. I've done a fair amount of fly fishing off of bulkheads, off of jetties and things like that. I have always struggled in the actual surf. Now, a quiet bay, if you're wading the sod banks in a back bay or something, that's totally chill. I mean, at times, like that's more like fishing a lake or a river, but doing it oceanside, line management is extremely important, right? Yes. In other words, so people understand what I mean, you're casting, you're stripping, you have line piling up at your feet. Well, if you're standing in the wash, the waves are constantly pushing the line back behind you. Things get tangled.
Yep.
So are you a stripping basket man when you do this?
I think the stripping basket's essential. I think you absolutely should always use a stripping basket, particularly in the surf. I kind of began my striper saltwater journey when I actually said, okay, I'm gonna do this a lot on Sandy Hook, and there's some nice big surf up on Sandy Hook, and it's not a very nice environment to cast a fly rod. You're dealing with wind, you're dealing with surf, you're dealing with leavings of Manhattan that sometimes wash up onto the beach. And so if you don't have a stripping basket, particularly in that situation, I mean, the line gets tangled after, 2 hits of a wave, and then, your day's over. So
you're just untangling line.
Let's
explain what a stripping basket is and does for those who don't know. I made my first one out of a wash tub I got at Dollar General.
That's a good, I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good one. So I began to go to the beach without a stripping basket. And learned very quickly that seeing those guys with the basket around their waist, kind of just cinched up with a clip, knew what they were doing. Right. So you read enough fishing magazines, you see enough people doing stuff from the beach. I mean, there's a really famous photo taken by our mutual acquaintance Tom Lynch of Bob Popovic's, the one of the greatest fly tyers of all time, casting on the beach. And the thing that you notice, besides the perfect loop that is tailing out into the water, is the stripping basket that's slightly off to the side there, right? So, even one of the great casters of our time, Bob's using a stripping basket to manage that line, because it like you said, one bad wave gets you on an open beach.
Sure.
Day's over.
Sure.
And so, the stripping basket has to, you have to get one that kind of, there are quite expensive ones. I was
going to say, you could YouTube. My old buddy Tim Romano once did a thing when I was at Field and Stream on how to make one out of like a Corona box, like in a pinch.
Sure,
right?
Absolutely.
So all it's doing is this sits at your waist. I mean, I use like an old wash tub. Funny story. When I first got into this, I was like, well, I need a stripping basket to strip all my running line into, so it's not all over the place. And I just went out and I cut some holes in a wash tub. Like it wasn't curved to like form fit your waist or anything. What I didn't do though, Mike, was drill any holes in the bottom of it for the water to drain out. So then I weighed it out and I'm stripping into the stripping basket, and a wave came in, and now that's buoyancy. It just lifted me up and threw me backwards. So
it's going to happen.
The expensive ones have drain holes, and they often have like little, like it almost looks like porcupine quills, like little plastic
little pegs.
Yeah. And what that does is, as you're stripping your line into it, it keeps it separated. It stops it from getting knotted up. Now, if you are on dry ground, like if you're on a sod bank, you're standing on dry ground, even a jetty, provided you're not taking like tons of water over the jetty, that becomes less necessary. But if you're wading or if you're fishing the surf, you kind of need it. We'll be right back after this short break.
Whenever I actually, to your point there, I still use it in the back bays. I still use it on the jetties. Anytime where I don't want line to be in my way. I want that basket. And, you can buy a very reasonable stripping basket anywhere that sells tackle. Or you can order a custom made one from Sweden, where those guys they make these ones that form fit to your body and have all this amazing stuff. But it really just depends on how often you're going to use it. And they also tend to be a fun place for stickers. So.
Right? Yeah. Yes. You can put all kinds of good stickers on a stripping basket for sure. That's a good point. But for those of you who might be new to this or thinking about dabbling in it, you're used to a river or a lake. It will frustrate you because line management is everything. Now, like most fish, you see some people tying some really crazy striper flies, multiple joints, game changer style stuff, big bunker patterns.
Yep.
But I think if there's one thing I've learned about fly fishing for stripers, and you might disagree. I mean, you tie a lot of your own flies, you tie beautiful stuff. There's 3 that I think it will kind of catch all of them almost. So let's see if we have the same 3. You go. If you had to narrow it down, because I don't want people to think that, again, with the money thing, like, I need this giant streamer box to go out there.
Yep.
I used to go with the smallest fly box with exactly 3 things in it.
Exactly 3. And I have a feeling that many will disagree with me, but some
hopefully people disagree with me all the time.
All right, well,
I'm used to it.
Joe, we're talking fly gear here.
I
right?
understand.
We have waded into the epitome of disagreement, right? So for me, I need Clousers.
Clouser minnow, number one.
I need Clouser minnows in various sizes, but I don't tie Clousers in anything other than olive and white or
pink over white, chartreuse over white. Yeah,
I mean nothing white. I actually started with a little olive and yellow that have been kind of fun, but. Anyway, we're not going to go fly tying right now, but Clouser style fly, a deceiver style fly with some hackle and some bucktail that's either tied hollow or straight like a deceiver. I mean, to mimic a bait fish. And then for me, around here in the Northeast and particularly Jersey. Surf candies, Popovic's surf candies, some epoxy
and they mimic sand eels, which is a specific forage to here. They see them, throughout New York and stuff. I don't know about further north in Massachusetts if there's the big sand eel run here.
They get a lot of sand eels on Cape Cod and there you go. And the Vineyard. And there's a fly that this really great tackle shop on Martha's Vineyard, Coop's Bait and Tackle. They've developed
Cooper Gilks, legend, man.
Cooper Gilks, Coop's floating minnow. Coop's floating sand eel. He's got a floating minnow too, but Coop's floating sand eel is just a little hollow-bodied fly that kind of bobs in the surface and again mimics a sand eel.
Sure.
So take your pick, but those three types of flies will mimic any sort of bait fish around.
So we were close. Mine were Clouser, Deceiver, and see, I always have to have like a small Bob's Banger, which is just a flat-faced popper because. You can't always rely on surface action, but like you don't want to be caught with your pants down if it's happening and they're boiling in front of you. You know what I mean? Like you kind of need to do that. But it's definitely one of those things I think people overthink a lot in terms of flies. But I think one of the most important things, one of the most intimidating things is certainly the wear, and we touched on that a little bit there in the beginning. I think one of the things that you have to get in your head. When you're doing this, you do have to go into it understanding that you are at a disadvantage to conventional guys, right?
Yes.
So what you have to get used to doing is thinking differently. Whereas, a guy with a 9-foot or 10-foot spinning rod, surf rod, might understand that fish at 50 feet beyond the first bar are very much in play for a metal lure. You almost have to train yourself to look for and understand where you're most likely to encounter fish within your range, even on the beach for that matter. Yep. I mean, call it like it is. If they're just a hair too far, you're out of the game. You need those fish. Look, everybody likes to be a hero. I can make a 70-foot cast. Okay, great. How often are you doing that, though?
I'm not doing that.
I mean, that's so I think really, and correct me if I'm wrong or if you see it differently because you do it more, like to me, like 25, 30 feet is like you need those fish in 25 or 30 feet of you. But if you understand how they behave and what to look for, that's not that difficult to find.
No, it's and I think a lot of that also applies even when you're on a boat, right? Like everybody thinks that in saltwater you need a 100-foot cast.
You don't.
Not in this game. You don't.
Even if you could make it, you ain't setting the hook that far.
You're not setting the hook that far. No, I mean, it looks pretty. It looks cool. I mean, it's probably make great content, but you're not gonna get the hookup rate that you want. When you're doing this inshore. Let's say from shore on the beach, you need to understand that if the fish aren't coming to you with a fly rod, you're just watching.
Yeah.
You're a spectator, and that's okay. And you can learn from watching, right? But like you said, 25 to 30 feet. If you can understand the way the water's moving, the way the water's working in that 25 to 30 feet out in front of you. You can. I mean, one of the biggest fish I ever caught was on the beach in Sandy Hook, in some pretty heavy surf, and just because I just happened to put the fly in between two sets of breakers where these fish were feeding in a trough.
Yeah.
If I was a little bit short or I was a little bit long, you wouldn't have gotten that. But you sit back and watch for a little while, and you can see like, well, the action is going to be. Stripers are predators of ease too, right?
Sure.
They don't want to work hard, particularly around a beach. For if the bait is going to be corralled up against where those waves are breaking, you can pretty much guarantee that the game fish are going to be right on the other side of that break.
Yeah.
The thing about that too, on when you're looking at a back bay or you're looking at a salt pond, knowing where the water changes are.
Yeah.
And usually those changes when you're looking at the shore are relatively close by.
Well, you mentioned earlier, the importance of scouting ahead of time. And that's especially important on the beach because you keep mentioning troughs. Now, some beaches, throughout the entire North Atlantic and Mid-Atlantic coast are very shallow. There's not a lot of structure there. Others have troughs. And at high tide, these fish, that's when they come in very close to feed in these troughs that sort of run parallel to the beach. Now, books have been written on reading beaches, but like the simplest tip I always can give people when they're like, and this is conventional or fly, you have to learn to watch waves. So like this is just a very top level, high level general rule. Waves are a product of the bottom and the depth. So if you see a wave break offshore and it rolls whitewater all the way to your feet on the beach, that means that the water was a consistent depth for the most part from where it broke all the way to you. You see a wave roll in and then flatten out closer to you, just disappears, and then maybe builds up a little bit closer to you. That means it encountered a trough of deep water between you and where it originally broke. So that's one of the things, the benefits of walking these beaches in summer at low tide, at all tides, to see, what kind of structures out there, and especially in the fall throughout a lot of the Northeast and even, down in the Mid-Atlantic later in the year, it is not uncommon. I've been out there wading. Of course, that day I didn't have a fly rod in my hand, but wading where like I wade out 20 feet into the surf onto the bar and I'm throwing ahead of me and like turn around and the fish are blowing up behind me between me and the beach.
Right.
They do come in that close. Now, jetties, I don't know how much time you spend on jetties. That becomes a matter of fishing. Then you start thinking about it more like a river. Like now you're dealing with how the moving water relates to that structure.
And I guess it also, it applies almost in most water, right? Water's always moving in the ocean. Water's always moving. And so when you're throwing off of a jetty, you're trying to throw with the way the water's moving, right? So you're trying to, as if you were reading a trout stream or reading a smallmouth stream. You're throwing so that your fly is going to end up right where the fish probably are feeding, right? Yeah. So throwing off a jetty, most of the jetties around here in the incoming tide, right? The fish are going to set up inside whatever area of water that you're looking at. Yeah. So you want to throw, with the tide and let your fly swing right to where they're feeding. On the outgoing tide, it's the opposite, right? You're throwing with and you're trying to get it to swing out so that they're feeding on the outside of the jetty. Now, fly fishing from a jetty, besides the dirty looks that you get all the time and the nasty way that people, try to say, that you're foolhardy, is also challenging for landing fish, right?
Sure.
Because when you're trying to land a fish off a jetty,
can't swing a 20-pounder up a jetty on a fly rod.
No, you can't do that. Can't do that. So having a really good anchor point on a jetty is very important. You have to be confident in your footing, confident on the rock placement, confident that you're able. Because the worst thing is you don't want to get into a fish and not be able to land it and have to figure out how to break off, or, because then that hurts the fish, that hurts you, it hurts everybody, and, your day's ruined. So understanding the structure of that jetty is going to be really important. I mean, you need good. I'm never going out on a jetty unless I got studs on the boots, or if I'm not trying to slip and fall and get washed out or washed in. So,
well, I think we've given a good baseline for an outfit, the handful of flies you need, some things to look for. And to your point, you're also going to learn by trial and error. Like
Yes.
you're going to go out there and figure out what your limitations are, right? Nothing comes easy in saltwater. You gotta sort of put in your time. But I think that this could really help somebody interested in trying this shorten that learning curve. Now, I'll end with this, though. So now you're talking to me, the guy who's never done this before. I'm going out this fall. I'm just getting into this. What are you telling me? What are your words of encouragement as a guy who's seen the glory of it, who's put in enough time to see it go down? And I know there's been a lot of days on the beach when, like you said earlier, it's like, I'm a spectator today. That's going to happen with a fly rod in your hand. What do you tell me?
The idea is that if you're going fishing for any other reason than deep personal enjoyment and engagement with the sport, and for me, I think you're kind of doing it wrong, because if you're going to go out and going to try to catch a dozen fish off the beach first time with a fly rod, I really hope you do, but I don't know if that's gonna be the case. So if you're gonna pick this up this fall for the first time, you're gonna see some amazing things. Hopefully, you'll meet some amazing people. You'll get to practice your cast quite a bit.
Yeah,
because
it's a great point.
It's a great point.
Or not, you're honing your skills.
You're honing those skills, and at the end of the day, you're going to learn every time you go out, and that for me is the reason why I keep coming back, learning every time.
So here's another little tidbit before we go, because we didn't get to touch on this. One of the most memorable striper fly bites I've ever been on was around a bridge at night. The lights from the bridge created a shadow line on the water, and the stripers were sitting in that shadow line just sipping these little calico crabs that were getting sucked out with the tide. And I just happened to have a floating crab pattern on me, and whenever my fly would come out of the light and hit that dark edge of the shadow line, a bass would just rise up and just suck it off the surface like a trout, and it was one of the coolest things. So if you can find a bridge, a bank, or a dock that has lights, okay, the fly rod can often be the best tool for bass in that scenario, because the forage they tend to be feeding on is small and therefore matched much more easily with flies. Huge thanks to Mike for joining me today and educating us on the foot striper fly game. I hope for some of you thinking about saltwater fly fishing and itching for the fall run, his knowledge made you even more excited to get out there. You can find Mike on Instagram at Michael Carr, CARR19, and I'm certain that if you have more questions, he'd be happy to answer them directly. You can find me on Instagram at Joe Cermele138, or shoot me an email at quickstrikepodcast@gmail.com. If you have ideas for future shows, I'd love to hear them. As always, thanks to Mike Pederson at 85 Audio for doing such a killer job engineering Quick Strike. And if you want to hear more from me, join me on my weekly long-form podcast, Cut and Retie, every Friday, wherever you get your podcasts.